Hello and welcome to the Crafted Closet. I'm Julie, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how I made this top. The pattern is Gwen from Violet Field Threads, and the fabric is the Star Spangled Collection from Erin Ann Designs for Hawthorne Supply Co. The trim pieces and buttons are from Joann's. All the seams are fully enclosed, so I'll show you how to do that. And then coming up in the next tutorial, I'll show you how I made the coordinating shorts, and they're fully reversible, so stay tuned for that. I'll link the pattern and fabrics in the description box below. So let's get started. So we are starting with the front bodice pieces, the back bodice elastic panel, the skirt pieces. So we have two for the front skirt and one for the back skirt, the placket pieces and the strap pieces. And then I've got two colors of rickrack for trim. So this is a fun little trick with rickrack. If you can't find like a perfect trim to go with your fabric, you can pick any two colors of rickrack and wrap them together to make a custom colored trim. So I'm going to start by cutting a piece this is my placket piece and my strap pieces, and I'm going to add trim to both of those. I'm going to start by cutting a piece that's a little bit longer because as you wrap them together, they'll kind of shrink up a little bit. And then you can take those two pieces and just, if you don't drop them, wrap them around each other. And then you do have to, this is why I cut it and didn't just wrap the whole thing together, you do have to keep it unwound at the bottom. So every so often, every few wraps, I go around and untwist it and then kind of flatten it out. And once I get it all wrapped together, I'll kind of iron it out too. So when you finish wrapping them together, it definitely wants to be all twisty, and you can use an iron just quickly, because this is polyester, so it will probably melt if you leave the iron on it too long, but you can just go through and just lightly iron it and then hold it flat. To flatten it out. And then for the opposite side of the placket, and I'll do the same thing for the straps, I'm going to wrap the opposite direction so that they mirror each other. This is kind of not necessary, but I like it. I think it looks like you've paid attention to details. So on this one, all of the diagonals are going down towards the right, and on this one, they're going down towards the left. So I've prepped my placket pieces by folding them in half and attaching a 3/4 inch wide strip of interfacing. And then on the side that I did not interface, I folded under about 3/8 of an inch, a little less than 1/2 an inch, so that once we attach it to the bodice and we fold this over, when we top stitch from the other side, we're making sure we catch this stitch or catch this edge and it all gets stitched together. Make sure when you're doing this that you're mirroring the two plackets, because you'll have one that's left and one that's right. So I'm working on the left placket piece, which is the side that the buttons will go on. I'm lining up the rickrack 1/2 an inch down from the top of the placket, and the center of the rickrack is 1/2 an inch over from the right side of the placket piece. I'm basting it in place with a 4 stitch length just so that it's easy to pull out if I need to go back and fix anything. I'm folding the rickrack out of the way at the top and the bottom. You do want to leave some rickrack in the seam allowance because it's a braided product, and if you cut it right at the edge, it's going to unravel and pull out of the seam. So here I'm just folding the bottom edges out of the way and finishing basting it in place. Now I'm going to sew the trim to the straps. For the straps, I've done the same thing as the placket except for the interfacing. So I folded it in half and then folded one side in 3/8 and ironed that. And I'm going to attach the trim to the opposite side. So again, I'm sewing it so that the center of the rickrack is 3/8 of an inch away from the edge of the strap. And this time I'm sewing with a 2.5 inch, or not 2.5 inch, a 2.5 stitch length. So once that's sewn, I'll fold this back. You could go iron it if you wanted to, and then fold the underside over. Probably throw a few pins in there. So you want to make sure that the underside covers up that stitch line. Then I'm going to switch my stitch length to a 3 and top stitch the strap. So I've got the right side of my 1/8 inch presser foot lined up with the edge of the fabric, and I'm sewing from the top. So there's the strap and the underside. Now we'll do the same with the other strap. Now we are going to baste the straps to the front bodice pieces. I've got my right front bodice and I've put pins at the markings on the pattern. This one I moved in 1/4 inch to allow for the extra width of the rickrack. And we're going to put right sides together, centering it on that mark, or centering the width of the strap on the mark. And then we're going to come making sure that we don't twist the strap over here. And mark the same, or pin the same. I'm realizing I didn't need to move that over because the strap is to the outside, or the rickrack is to the outside, not to the inside. So now that I have those pinned, I will baste that in place. That's basted in place. I will do the same on the other side. Now I will sew the lining to the bodice main. I'm just going to throw a few pins in there just because of the strap, just so that it holds everything in place where it's supposed to be. And I'll sew this at 1/2 inch. the strap, I'm going to back stitch just to give it some more security. I'm going to trim the straight parts with my little scissors to 1/8 of an inch, and then when I get over to these curvy bits, I'm going to switch to my pinking shears. Actually, I didn't do this on the back, but at the top here, I'm going to leave more of the strap in place. And I'll come back over to the other side with that strap and come back down. And then at this little front corner, I'm going to clip into that point with my scissors. Then I'll turn everything to the right side and go press that open. So here's the finished front bodice piece. Next, we're going to sew the elastic panels together. Or not panels, panel. So I've got right sides together, and I'm going to sew the top at 1/2 inch. And now I will go iron this seam open. So now I have that ironed out so that the fabrics are wrong sides together, and we're going to sew the channels for the elastic. The first one is going to be 5/8 of an inch down from the top. The next one, I'm going to deviate from the pattern a little bit because I want to be able to enclose this bottom edge of the bodice. So I'm going to sew up 1 inch from the bottom. And then, because I don't have marks that far out, I'm going to line up my ruler at 5/8 of an inch from that line that we just sewed and draw, draw a line at 5/8, and then let's see, that gives me 3 7/8 between those two stitch lines. So 1/2 of 3 7/8 is, can I math in my head? It's gonna be 1 15/16, and then we're going to draw a line that is 5/16 down from there and 5/16 up from there. So same thing on this other side. We will do 1 15/16, and then 5/16 up, 5/16 down, and then we'll connect those lines. Those the measurement to the center is going to vary based on the size of the dress you're making, so yours may not be the exact same. So now I'll sew along all 3 of those lines. Now I'm going to start the elastic in the casings. So I've got them cut based on what the pattern calls for. I'm going to take a safety pin, feed it through one end, feed that into my bodice. I'm going to pull it so that it's just even with the edge of the panel. And then I'm going to baste that in place. Feed it the rest of the way through. Stop for a minute, please. Pull it so that it's all the way lined up with the other edge, and then baste that in place. And then I'll do that with the other 2 pieces of elastic. So now we're going to attach the elastic panel to the front bodice pieces. We're going to spread that apart. We're going to pull the fabric towards the center of the elastic panel so that we can get nice flat edges to sew it along. Then we're going to pin to just front side to front side, right side's facing. And when we sew this together, we're going to stop sewing at this 1 inch up from the bottom. And then after we get that pinned in place, you could baste that in place if you wanted to. I'm going to skip that and just turn it so that the lining piece is now on top of the elastic panel, and just kind of tuck everything inside. Starting at the top, 1/2 inch seam allowance, into backstitch, stop sewing 1 inch before I get to the bottom. Backstitch there. And then to finish the seam, I'm going to open up and sew the lining to the lining and then the main to the main. So again, 1/2 inch. And then main to main. And then pull that out. And fully inserted, fully enclosed. And then when we attach the skirt, we'll be able to attach it in here and fold both front and back down to enclose that skirt seam. So I will do the same thing with the other side of the bodice. So here's the bodice assembled so far, and enclosed elastic panel from the inside and then from the back. Next, we're going to assemble the skirt. To assemble the skirt, I am going to French seam the side seams. So I have my skirt pieces wrong sides together. I'm going to sew at 1/4 inch. I'm trimming the seam to 1/8 inch. Then I'll open it up and finger press that open. You could also iron that, and then fold it right sides together. Then sew at 1/4 inch to finish up that French seam. And then I'll do the same thing on the other skirt seam. So I've pressed the hem up 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch, and I'm going to finish the hem. Switch to a 3 stitch length of 3. I'm going to line up the edge of the hem with the 5mm 3/16 inch mark. Now that the hem's done, I'm going to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches with a 4-length stitch on my machine, and I'm going to sew the first one at 3/16 inch, and the second one will be at 3/8 inch. Now that I have my gathering stitches run, I'm going to mark some registration marks before I gather. So I've lined up my side seams and pulled it taut. So this gives me my center point of the back of the skirt. And then I will fold that so that it lines up with the side seams. And that will give me 1/4 points. So I'll clip those. And then on the back of the skirt, or not the back, the front of the skirt, I'm going to fold back. I'm going to leave 1/2 inch here that will leave ungathered, and then line up 1/2 inch in with the side seams and clip a notch there. And I'll do that on the other side of the skirt as well. And then I will separate my bobbin threads from my top threads and pull the bobbin threads and gather the fabric along the bobbin threads. So I will keep pulling that and spreading it until the skirt is the same width as the bodice. So now I'm going to mark the same registration points on the bodice piece. I'm going to start by finding the center back, which is in the elastic panel. And to do that, I'm going to pull the fabric flat and just work my way over and mark a center notch. I'm going to use this seam as the quarter points for the back, quarter points for the back. And then I'm going to line up 1/2 inch with the center back and pull that to find the side seam of the skirt. And then I'll do 1/2 inch over from the edge, line up, and that'll give me the quarter point of the front. So I'll do the same thing on the other half. I have my skirt gathered and notches cut in my bodice. I have the bodice underneath and the skirt on top. I'm going to start at the center back. I'm going to make sure that I'm separating out the main fabric from the lining. I've marked my notches in the skirt with pins just so that they're easier for me to see as I do this tutorial. You don't have to mark them with pins before doing it. On the elastic panel, you want to make sure that you're pulling the fabric out straight while you're lining up the gathers, because you want that elastic panel to be able to fully expand while the person's wearing it or getting in and out of it. And if you didn't pull the gathers out, then it would be stuck at the width. Or if you didn't pull it out to its full width, it would be stuck at whatever width you sewed the gathers in. Hopefully that makes sense. And then so I've pinned at the center and then at that side seam of the elastic panel, and then I'm just going to spread the rest of the gathers out evenly across the full width of that fabric. And throw in a few more pins. Line up my next pin with the notch in the bodice. Spread my gathers. I'll keep doing that all the way along the length of the bodice until I get the skirt attached. All of the skirt gathers are now pinned in place. I've left 1/2 inch at the front centers ungathered so that we can attach the plackets after the skirt's attached. And I'm just going to sew those in place. So I like to go slowly when I'm doing, switch back down to construction length stitch, so 2.5 back stitch. Sewing with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I like to go very slowly when I sew gathers in place. And if you pull from the hem and hold with your right hand, you can kind of help straighten those gathers as you go along. Next, we're going to pin the lining in place. So you want to make sure that the lining's laying nice and flat and smooth along the bodice. I'm going to fold under 1/2 inch so that it's just meeting the stitch line that we just did for the skirt. And then about every inch, I add a pin. You want to make sure you're not pulling the lining too tight because it'll cause the front to buckle or pucker, and if you leave it too loose, then it will show, the lining will show from the front, so you kind of want to get it just right. And then when we get to this elastic panel, you're going to turn that under 1/2 inch and hold it down and pin in place. As you go along the elastic panel, you want to pull it just like we did when we attached the skirt. You want to pull it so that it's nice and flat, and then pin it in place. And when we top stitch it in place, we'll pull it out so that it's, the fabric's laying flat all the way along. So I will get all of this pinned in place and meet you back at the sewing machine. So I have the lining all pinned in place now. I'm going to turn it over and sew from the top side. I have an 1/8 inch presser foot, so I'm lining the edge of the presser foot up with the edge of the bodice. And I'm going to switch this to a 3 stitch length. And I can reach under and take out pins as I go. Now we've come to the elastic panel, so I'm going to make sure that I'm pulling this nice and straight as I go over it. So the lining's all attached and top stitching from the outside. Now we get to attach the button plackets. All right, now we're going to attach the button placket piece to the center front of the bodice. So far I haven't trimmed this off yet. I will do that after I sew it on, but I am going to fold them back. You want to leave some of the rickrack in the seam allowance so that it doesn't unravel and start coming off of the garment. So I'm going to put these right sides together. I'm going to start with the top of the button placket 1/2 inch above the top of the bodice and start pinning in place. fold the rickrack so that it'll be caught in the seam allowance, and I'm going to finish with the bottom of the placket 1/2 inch past the hem of the skirt. Now I'm going to start sewing 1/2 inch down from the top of the placket with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew right along the basting stitch that I used to attach the rickrack to the placket. And again, I'll stop sewing 1/2 inch before I get to the bottom of the placket. Now I'm going to fold the placket right sides together on itself at the bottom. And I'm going to sew right at that hem edge. And then I can fold this back, fold this in, push out the corner, and now my placket folds back on itself. So I'll do the same thing at the top of the bodice. So now I've trimmed the extra rickrack. You do want to leave some in the seam allowance just because it's a braided product and you don't want it to unravel and pull out of the bodice. Then I'm going to flip that all towards the placket, turn this corner out, use my scissors to poke out that corner, get it nice and square, and then we already pressed this earlier, so we're just going to line up that pressed edge with the stitch line of the seam we just sewed. Now pin in place all along. I'll pin this in place all along the placket. So I now have the back side of the placket all pinned in, and I'm going to flip it to the front and sew it in. This, because of the rickrack in there, this has quite a bit of bulk to it, so I'm going to start by putting my needle down. Well, I'm going to switch to a 3 stitch length for top stitching. I'm going to start by putting my needle down actually in the fabric, and I've got tails here so that I can tie off and bury the threads when I'm finished. I don't like to backstitch top stitching when it's in a spot that's this prominent. And then I'm just going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of that placket. Now top stitched, and from the back I've caught the back side of the placket as well. So now we just need to add buttonholes and buttons. I tried to make buttonholes along this placket and my machine just did not like the difference in thickness between where the rickrack is under here and just the folded edge, and it just wouldn't do it. So I've started to unpick this, and I'm going to redo the placket a different way so that I can make buttonholes. So I've recut that placket piece. I've folded it the same way that we did before. I'm going to fold it so that the front and back are right sides together. And so the ends are with a 1/2 inch seam allowance just to the fold of the underside of the placket. And I'll do the same for the top of the placket. I don't like a thread right at the edge of that, so I start inside and then back stitch to the edge and then go forward again. Stitch. And then I can turn these so that they're right side out. And I'll push the corners out and then mark for the... So here's my button placket, and I'm going to mark my buttonholes. I'm going to make the buttonholes before attaching it to the bodice. That way we can get around all that thickness from the rickrack. So I want the buttonholes to be 3/8 of an inch in from the edge, because the placket is 3/4 of an inch wide. I want the first one to be, let's do 3/8 of an inch down. And then I'm going to mark them every 2 inches and have 6. So you don't need buttons every 2 inches. That's a little bit overkill, but I love these little buttons and I want to use all of them. So I'm going to do every 2 inches. I usually do buttonholes between 2.5 and 3 inches apart, depending on the garment and how big it is. For smaller kids, I do them a little closer together. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so now I'm going to go sew those buttonholes in place. And I put them on, I've made my markings on the front. So this is the back, and the front still has this little flap that's going to get sewn to the front bodice, fully opened. Lined up my mark for my buttonhole with the center of the buttonhole foot. I made sure my fabric is straight, and I'm going to make the first buttonhole. And then I will move to the next mark. Line it up. And now I've pinned my rickrack to the revised placket, 1/2 inch in, well, the center of the rickrack. Center of the rickrack is 1/2 inch in from the edge of the front of the placket. And when I base this on, I want to make sure that I'm not catching this underside of the placket. So I'm going to fold it out of the way. And then 1/2 inch from the edge, I'm just going to baste this in place. Baste it in place. And now I'm going to grab the bodice. I'm going to line up the top of the bodice with the top of the placket. I'm just going to pin this in and pull. This is the bottom of the placket is now facing up. I'm going to pull that out of the way and sew the front of the placket to the front of the bodice. And I'm just going right over my basting stitch, so 1/2 inch from the edge. Okay, so that's attached. Now we're going to trim off the excess without trimming the rickrack. So we can trim off a little bit right here at the end, but you don't want to trim through the pieces of rickrack. So I might go on either side and trim down. Just to make sure I don't catch the rickrack. So I will, let's see. Just so you can see right there. I'm just trimming off the excess, but I'm making sure I don't get the rickrack. So I will get that all the way done and come back. So I left about 1/4 inch there, left all the rickrack intact. And now I'm gonna go from the back and tuck that seam allowance underneath the back of our placket and then pin the placket in place. So I'll pin that all the way along. So I have the back of the placket all pinned in place. All of those raw edges are tucked in, and now I'm going to turn it to the right side, just like we did with the other placket. And top stitch. Now we're top stitched from the front side, and the back side has caught all of those edges. So now we just need to open the buttonholes, sew on the buttons, and we're done. Here's the finished top. You can see all that cute rickrack trim, and I've added the buttons. You can see the shorts coming up. Those will be my next video, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.